Did you used to do that thing in like elementary school or middle school or high school where you have something that you're working on for like an algebra test, and there's a lot of material and it's tough stuff, and you are kind of trying to learn it, but also it's very frustrating and it's not really what you want to do with your time. And then your parents are like, "Hey, honey, how you doing with that algebra stuff?" And you're like, "Oh, it's fine." And they're like, "Oh yeah, you're doing okay." And you're like, "Yeah, it's fine." And even though they would like help you, possibly, or try to find you some sort of source for help for it, you'd rather not deal with it right now. And so eventually you get to some sort of homework assignment that you stop doing, and then you try to like scramble it out that morning, maybe filling in the answers from a friend's paper and turning it in or something like that. And then you get to the point where you take a test, and then it's not so good, and then all of a sudden you have this report card, and it's not good, and you're not passing algebra, let's say, and your parents are like, "Hey, what's going on here with algebra?" And you go, "Oh, that teacher hates me." We've all kind of done this, where all of a sudden it feels like it's not so much that other things piled up. It's not so much that you had lots of other responsibilities, that this wasn't coming easy to you, that you didn't want to be bothered and pestered and pressured by your folks, and you didn't want to face the music when it came to asking for some sort of clarification from somebody, the teacher, a parent, a tutor, or whatever, to try and understand the material, and you try to scramble through because this has worked before, right? This has worked before. You faked your way through something else, and maybe you didn't read a book you were supposed to read, and you ended up getting a good grade on it or something like that. And you've seen that this works out, and been able to get an A or a B or something else that you're not upset about bringing home. But this time it didn't work out, and this time when push comes to shove, you can recall in your mind all these times the teacher has been unfair. You can remember when the teacher didn't want to take that late work, or when the teacher was like short with you when you did ask a question, or when they didn't call on you when you raised your hand, or you were otherwise frustrating to them. And you're cutting out all of the things that added up to the situation that you're in. And you're leaning on all the things that confirm that you're a victim here, and that you should not be judged by this grade. Now, listen, I'm probably the last person in this world who's going to sit here and tell you that you should be judged by a grade. I think grades are a terrible blight on our education system, and the sooner we come up with something better than grades, which incidentally we have several things better than grades, they're just not efficient or cost effective, and involve a lot smaller class sizes and more personal attention, that we don't want to invest in the structures, the better for learning. If we can get rid of grades, we should. But sometimes that this has nothing to do with the personality of the teacher, that this has nothing to do with being some sort of a victim here. In fact, maybe the victim is from something else. Maybe the victim, maybe you are somewhat of a victim because you're being pushed in so many directions. You have 7 different subjects you're learning at once, and your parents really wanted you to be on that ball team, and you're doing that until 5 p.m. at night or something like that. And then you know that if you tell them you're struggling with this subject, that they're going to kind of bring the heat on you. That they're going to be impatient because they're tired and it's the end of their day, and they don't want to work with you on it, and they are frustrated with the fact that they have to step in and that you're not getting this. And so you want to avoid all of that, and you're easily able to fold it into this third party thing of the teacher hates me. Now, I'm also not going to negate the fact that sometimes a teacher might hate you. I don't know. I'm not you. I had a teacher who was a sociopath once, a German teacher, and she hated all of us, except for a select few. And I stand by that. She totally did. And she didn't victimize our grades necessarily for it, but she made our lives awful. Incidentally, she wasn't German herself. Everybody kind of jumps to that. She wasn't. Interesting. What I'm getting at here is cognitive dissonance. cognitive dissonance is a very powerful tool that your brain has. And cognitive dissonance, the term, as I first heard it, was a musical term. And I don't know if that's the case or if it was always a psychological term first. In music, we have harmony, and that's when two different notes play at the same time and sound good. And then we have dissonance, which is when two notes play at the same time and they sound like noise. They sound bad. But here's the thing. If you keep playing those bad notes over and over together, eventually the ear will adjust and it will sound good. If that doesn't make any sense to you, delve into the history of Western music sometime. It's very fascinating that the harmonies that we listen to today in music would have been seen as absolute noise to people a few hundred years ago. In the 1400s, harmonies were much broader spaced. The notes were a little bit broader spaced from each other, and there were even certain dissonances that were outlawed by the church as being the devil's very notes. And as music evolves and becomes like renewed by each person who picks up that torch and runs with it, the harmonies have gotten close together, the rhythms have become influenced by other parts of the world, and we have a completely different sound. And what has happened is this cognitive dissonance, that we have adjusted our ears and our vocabulary for what is considered musical, and we're much richer for it. But when we apply this to our actual cognition, what we're looking at is this self-justification process, this process that hides negative information about ourselves and justifies choices that we've made. Some of the most obvious ways that you'll see cognitive dissonance play out is in relationships. Let's say that somebody is dating someone else and it's not going well, and they're able to justify their decision to date them by saying things like, oh, all relationships are like this, or yeah, you can't find a guy who doesn't behave this way, or all girls treat you this way, or whatever. And this way to rationalize and build a system of logic off of a bad decision into a world in which you are doomed to this type of negativity should you want to be in a relationship, and you're just sort of screwed, so you might as well stay in this one. And other times you'll see it, somebody will undertake a college program that they're not really into or they didn't really like, and they will spend more and more money and more time justifying it. Or you buy a car that's a lemon and it obviously didn't work out, and you just can't get behind the idea that you've wasted your money on this car, so you're constantly reinvesting and repairing, and you're constantly coming up with different reasons why this was a good idea. Those are really obvious ways that we see it. Just like the time that you decided that your teacher hates you, it's a selective cherry picking of reality that supports the framework that you're operating in. And honestly, this is a somewhat forgiving process. What I mean is that if we were really able to see ourselves and our choices in the actual light that is shed upon it, we wouldn't be as happy. We shouldn't see ourselves as perfect, obviously, and we tend to catch the flaws in other people a lot faster than we catch them in ourselves. But I do think that it's helpful that we're able to forgive ourselves and move on, that we're able to rationalize choices that we make and stop regretting, because regret is a complete waste of time. But it would be nice and wonderful if we could change our minds more rapidly, if we could take in information and consider things from the point where we're standing and not based on the decisions we've made, and change our minds in effective ways. Instead, what we do is construct narratives, and we construct narratives that show causation in the light in which we want to see causation. And none of us are safe from this. all of us fall victim to this, and we all do it every single day, and I'm not excluding myself from this. So let's say that a company's doing really well. You're going to read about some company that's like killing it out there. It's some sort of a tech startup company, and they've come up with some sort of new process, and everybody loves it, and they're making a lot of money. You're going to read some sort of interview with someone who's going to credit so much to the CEO, that the CEO has made all the right moves, that they saw this opportunity, that they shifted resources over here, and they're going to construct a story in which this very forward-thinking individual was able to create all sorts of prosperity based on reading the situation. And if that company then goes south, you're going to read from the perspective of the company or from the CEO all of these external factors that couldn't have possibly been predicted, that basically victimized this market, that showed a misunderstanding on the public's part of what this technology was all about, and explain failure not through the lens of the actions of the CEO or the actions of the company, but rather through the conglomeration of external factors that were absolutely beyond the control of the circumstances. Neither one of these stories is really any more true than the other. The problem here is that we are addicted to causation, that we love to see the reasons why things happened. And we always want to do these post-mortem evaluations of why something was successful or why something was a failure. And we want to credit someone to it, some sort of decision-making process, or we want to credit some sort of circumstances to it. But when it comes down to it, what we're basically doing is convincing ourselves that reality is knowable and predictable. We're convincing ourselves that we're existing in a sort of known state of being where, again, we're fighting against this notion of a changing world and trying to embrace the idea that there is an unchanging truth at the base of all of this stuff that we can know, and that based on that we can make predictions. And that if somebody misses something, that they should have seen it, and that if things work out well for someone, that it's because they saw it, that it's because they were tapped into this sort of like spine of truth that runs through a changing world and is absolutely unchangeable in its own self. But that's not where we live. We live in an absolutely changeable world that is changing all the time, that is not predictable and not knowable. And when people do act like they could have predicted something, or if they did predict something, dude, there's billions and billions of people out there. Somebody predicted what was going to happen this time. Somebody saw, this crisis or this disaster or this opportunity. Sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean they were in the right place in the right time to capitalize on it, to warn people, to change things, whatever. And it doesn't mean that people would have listened if they were in the right place at the right time. Success stories are a lot of luck, a lot of being at the right place at the right time, and a lot of other people having the same idea and just for whatever reason, it not going through. There is no way to force success. There is no way to force your way into some sort of like righteous success story that that you see in movies or that you read about in books. When people do have these great big successful lives, these great big successful business ventures or whatever it is not because of their superior work ethic or their superior powers of prediction or their inventiveness or anything like that. I hate to tell you that because we want to count on these things. Instead, they're performing these postmortems that show causation in a way that paints them in a very, very positive light. And that's like the same thing with this cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance opens us up to decisions that we shouldn't make, to chipping away at our principles in our ethics as we can sort of justify going one more step in one direction than another. And it hides this from us, that we don't see that we are making compromises. That instead what we see is a choice from a long time ago that needs to be supported. And we see these little tiny steps in one direction or another as inconsequential. And we're able to tell ourselves that we are still behaving through our own moral fiber or through our own ethical ideals or whatever it is. And we instead are able to justify actions that we've taken based on our picture of ourselves as a fundamentally good person, as a fundamentally smart person, a fundamentally strong person or loyal person or steadfast person or whatever it is that you see yourself as at the time that you're making this decision. Just imagine how many times in your life you've done something that you should be very regretful of, and you've managed to be able to say something like, I wasn't feeling myself, or but you had no choice, or but this isn't you. That even when you are really sorry, I'm sorry, that's not me. As if we can pick and choose our actions based on who we want to see ourselves as. As if we can look back at our lives and pick and choose the parts of us that add up to what we've done and who we are, rather than having to own those actions. This sounds like a downer. It sounds like it's really troublesome because it is. This self-justification process is something that's completely hidden from view and that we adhere to almost all the time. So it allows for grave mistakes to be made and for us to never own up to them and never feel like we do ever see that it was a mistake, never feel like that was part of what we were trying to do or who we are, and it essentially leaves the self blameless. Basically, you have these two ideas. This idea of who you are and this idea of what you have done or decision that you've made. And these two ideas are in conflict. There's dissonance between these things. And you have to resolve the dissonance. One way to resolve the dissonance might be going and offering an apology. It might be taking responsibility. Or it might be stopping the course that you're on, stopping, let's say, your college studies and saying, no, this isn't actually what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer, not a lawyer, or whatever it is, or I wanted to be a lawyer, not a doctor, and or I wanted to be a street musician and not a teacher. And changing your life around. That's one way to resolve the dissonance. But that's generally not the way that we choose. Generally, the way that we choose is by justifying the decision because we see this decision that we had made as somehow inherently part of that picture of who we are, despite the dissonance. When you start studying this stuff and you start really reading about cognitive dissonance, what you find is that people are driven by the resolution of dissonance all the time. We are obsessed with resolving dissonance. Dissonance manifests as anxiety. It manifests as depression. It manifests as panic. And it manifests as unhappiness in our lives. And we are constantly seeking to resolve it, to bring it into harmony, to pull these two ideas around until they match. And usually what this means is doubling down on a bad decision, doubling down on going the direction that is not correct. And this is something that to overcome, you have to have some sort of a kill switch in your mind. You have to have the ability to notice when you're doing it, to stop in your tracks and evaluate, am I just resolving dissonance here? And then to change directions. And you know what? That is superhuman. The way people behave these days, it is absolutely superhuman. Because we live in a world that's not very forgiving. We live in a world that does not accept mistakes very well. It much more readily accepts you trying to resolve this dissonance by doubling down on a mistake. You see companies and governments and organizations throw money away this way all the time. You see building projects that come in with one estimate, and over years and years, they keep going up and up and up. And at no point does anybody ever pull the plug and say, no, 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 this isn't what we wanted to do. No, they just go ahead and pay 10 times their original idea of what the building would be. You see this happen in people's lives all the time, where they'll stay living in a town where they didn't want to, where they'll stay in a relationship, where they will not let go of that money pit of a house or a car, or they will not get out of their career because it seems like maybe it's just about to get better. It seems like this is just about to turn around. And they just are missing that part where they'd be able to recognize what they're doing and change direction. Because again, this is nearly superhuman. So one thing that cognitive dissonance plays on a lot, one thing that can really cause a lot of dissonance in our mind to begin with, is this notion of implicit bias. Implicit bias, you could take a whole class on implicit bias, because just like cognitive dissonance, this is about your brain hiding something from you. It's hiding from you your preferences in people, your preferences in situations, your preferences in the way that, again, that you see yourself. Implicit bias is a bias that you have. Usually the way we use it today is against someone's race, someone's socioeconomic class, someone's gender, some other categorization of somebody that we have grown up being at dissonance with. So, for example, we have found through research that implicit bias makes it where many white police officers are more likely to see a non-weapon as a weapon if it's in the hands of a black suspect. So a stapler, a comb, a cell phone comes across as a gun or a knife in the mind of the white police officer looking at a black suspect, where that same item does not seem to be such a thing in the hands of a white suspect. We've seen it happen in the justice system. We've seen where some people are just good people who made a mistake and they need some forgiveness. All they did was something that just happened this once, and they shouldn't have their whole future ruined for it because they're like the court, because they are benefiting from the implicit bias of that jury or that judge or what have you. And then, other people, as, generally we're speaking about minorities here, get much sterner sentences because they're seen as thugs. They're seen as counterculture to the dominant white culture that's out there. And our implicit bias is so easy to grow within you. And that, again, this is because your brain wants to make the world really knowable and really predictable. It wants to convince you that that's the case. So it invents these little shelves, these little types for people, where you don't see people like you as fitting on some sort of like a shelf or type. You are more apt to see them as individuals. So this is why white people benefit from the power structure, because the power structure is driven mainly by white people of privilege and by white culture. And so it sees individuals that are stuck in a system where it sees, foreigners or black people or people of a different religion as having some sort of evilness to them, that it's at dissonance with those things. and that we're able to sort of see them as one type. So imagine, if you're white, just imagine that going somewhere and doing something and knowing that your actions and your presence, all white people are being judged by. We're not used to that. We're not used to having to represent our race, represent our gender. That's not the white hat that we wear. And yet, if somebody cuts us off in the road and it's a black guy, suddenly, black people are bad drivers. Suddenly you make this big assumption because your brain is trying to categorize and make things knowable and predictable for the future. And you don't see them as an individual. Or if you're a white male and a woman does it, and now women are bad drivers and what have you. If you're a waiter and someone of your race doesn't tip well, that guy might be a jerk. And then someone of a different race doesn't tip well. That whole race is a jerk. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet we know that it comes from this blank spot in our cognition, but we also know that it comes from the way that we're raised and what we see modeled to us, what templates we see. So your parents, especially, or whoever it is that raises you, gives you different templates for how to behave on a daily basis, how to interact with the world around you. So, for example, when my kids go and sit down at a table for dinner, they put a napkin on their lap and they don't take a bite till everybody else is sitting down. This is probably a rule that I laid down at some point, but it's also a behavior that I have modeled day in and day out, every single day of their lives. And why was this a rule, and why did I model it? Because I saw my parents do it. My parents, for anything else that they explicitly might have taught me, about credit, let's say, or managing money, or interacting with people, or language skills, those kind of things that you think you have to teach your kids. More powerful than any of that is watching them. You watch them day in and day out, and you just absorb it. You pick it up. I mean, this is really how you picked up language skills in the first place. So someday, hundreds of years from now, there will be a kid who's a progeny of mine who will look back and see a picture of my dad and have no idea who this guy was. He'll look at this picture and say, oh yeah, this is someone from my family. I don't really know who. And when this kid goes and sits down at the table, they will put a napkin on their lap and they will wait for everybody else to sit down before they take a bite to eat. And they will have no idea that what they're doing is carrying the very torch that my dad, that guy in the picture who they weren't able to recognize, passed to me, and that I passed to my kids, and that they passed to their kids. They will have an implicit action that has to do with the template that we give them for, what I see as table manners, but is just the way I was raised. Now take that template and point it towards a parent who might tell their kid not to be racist, but still says things about races. Might tell their kid not to be sexist, but still makes sexist remarks. Might tell their kid not to discriminate against sexuality, but also clearly has a preference of what their kid's sexuality might be. These templates are powerful, and they have very little to do with what you say. They have everything to do with what you do. My kids read a lot. They see their dad and mom reading a lot. I saw my parents reading a lot. It's a healthy habit to pass down. And, Lord knows there's all sorts of unhealthy habits that can pass around. And Lord knows what sorts of implicit biases I'm giving to my kids. Surely they're out there. And It's a hard thing to recognize because you feel as if this is hardwired in your brain. And then it is reinforced by the world around you. It's reinforced by the news stories that you pay attention to because you pay attention to the ones that agree with that implicit bias. And it's hardwired into your search engine because Google gives you back information that is personalized to your search habits so that it also agrees with your implicit bias. And your friends list on Instagram or Facebook or whatever sort of Slack thing that you have out there, being a Gen Z person, um, create these other echo chambers that point back your implicit biases at you, that you don't see the other perspective because the other perspective causes dissonance. So I'm not saying that people are blameless for acting in racist, sexist ways, but they don't realize that that's what's happening most of the time. It does get explicit, and then we see stories about that, and it seems absurd, absolutely absurd. Obviously, if your all of your pride is wrapped up in what race you are, you don't have to actually accomplish anything. You can just sit back and let the rest of the race do it. And if you're not doing well, then you can blame other races at victimizing you. It's starting to make some sense. Our implicit bias and cognitive dissonance walk hand in hand in our lives. They walk hand in hand in the way that we witness the world. When we convince ourselves that the world is knowable and predictable, we convince ourselves that it's doing it on the terms that agree with us, that agree with the way we were raised, and agree with the templates that we have, and agree with the way we see ourselves as a victim when we're not successful and as a hero when we are. It's a depressing point of view. From this, we can begin to start extrapolating massive social problems, massive challenges at getting a country or a planet full of lots of different people to live and work together. Not just races and genders and identities, but also ideas and preferences and points of view. It's difficult, and it causes lots and lots of problems. And it all boils down to us trying to live comfortably in our own heads and masking all of these things that we should be addressing and changing about ourselves so that we remain comfortable in our own heads. It's not a pretty picture. A lot of what we inherit is not a pretty picture. I read a meme the other day that said something about how if you're reading history and it's making you proud instead of uncomfortable, you're not reading history, you're reading propaganda. There is certainly a lot to be proud of at being a person, but you cannot take credit. You cannot take credit for these things that you're proud of for being a person if you're not addressing our absolute shameful past and shameful interactions with each other and shameful ways that we have treated other people and creatures on the planet or in the planet itself. But we are more than willing to accept these comforts that our brain gives us by masking all of this. Before you go pointing this information at other political camps and other people, you need to sit with it with yourself. And that is probably the hardest thing to do.